All right. Well, let me get my screens all set and then I will get started. So, Lara asked me to talk today about what we need to know about the problem of dialogue on campuses. Um, and I just want to give a heads up before we start. I tried to add in some things during the break from our conversation. So, Lara, sorry if there's any surprises in here, but there's so many connections between what we were talking about in the last session and what I want to talk about in this session. So I think that's going to be really fun. So as I initially sat down to think about this question about what do we need to know, it occurred to me that a lot of the answer depends on what we think we already know. And then, of course, juxtaposed on that, what we actually know, which I would argue are all too often pretty far apart when it comes to issues of speech and dialogue on campus. So where I think we need to start, at least in answering this question, is what falls in this gap. What is the gap between what we know and what we think we know? And then we can start to figure out what it is we still need to know in order to promote positive dialogue on college campuses. So I'm going to structure my talk around 5 assumptions that I see implicit in a lot of the discussions around this so-called problem of dialogue on college campuses. Regardless of whether or not you personally agree with any of these assumptions that I'm going to draw attention to here, I think they have tremendous influence over the broader discourse around speech and expression on campus. With each of those assumptions, I'm going to tell you why I think they don't hold up to scrutiny. And at times are even contradictory within themselves or with other assumptions. And yet I think these are all at play at the same time. And then I'm going to talk through what questions remain. If we throw out these assumptions, how does that help us understand what we still need to know? For some of these questions, we do have knowledge that we can start to apply towards at least beginning to understand the answers. And for others, we don't. For others, I don't think we know much at all. I think this is really the meat of what we need to know to understand the challenges of dialogue on college campuses. So assumption number 1 that I see and that I think we really got into some in the first session was this assumption that all things can and should be said in class or on campus with very few limitations. People will generally acknowledge the typical First Amendment limitations. But as we were talking about in the first session, universities are not necessarily wide open public forums. They contain many different types of forums, legally, of course, but then also philosophically and educationally. And so different kinds of speech environments, different kinds of dialogue is going to be appropriate in different types of forums. Perhaps the more controversial point that I'll make in upending this assumption is that the point of the university is to curate ideas. Ron talked about this as gatekeeping. I like to think about it as curation, but it gets at both are metaphors for the same underlying principle that the point of academic inquiry is to judge what ideas are better than others, which ideas have more evidence behind them, which are based in more convincing arguments. This is literally what we do all day, every day in higher education. As a professor, I write papers, I give talks, and people then get to judge whether the ideas I'm presenting are valid and substantiated. I teach classes and grade students' work, judging their work in much the same way that my own work is judged. And sure, I may have the right, in theory, to express whatever I want in a presentation like this or write whatever I want in a paper, but that doesn't mean I get to publish that paper. It doesn't mean that I have the right to be invited to be a speaker if my ideas are really just terrible and I don't substantiate them. And likewise, students could technically write whatever they want in a paper, but they're not going to pass the class unless they can substantiate what they're writing based on a commonly agreed upon set of evidence in a particular discipline. And so I think that the debates that we have about what ideas belong or don't, how far that gate should be open, what we include or don't include, are really debates about curation that masquerade as debates over issues of free speech. Also, I've found in my research with college students and in just more informal discussions with faculty and administrators that most people have a line somewhere. They will draw lines about what is out of bounds in a given context. Maybe that's inbounds in another context, maybe it's not. But you can almost always find a line that someone has that people just shouldn't cross. And that sort of gets at some of these sub-assumptions that I have up here, the things that I think are related to the main assumption, this idea that students and faculty have a fundamental right to express themselves in class or on campus. Yes, but as I was saying, that's not what academic inquiry is actually all about. There's also this assumption that this wide open marketplace of ideas will lead to the best educational outcomes. And while that is sometimes true, it's also sometimes not. Not all ideas, not all types of expression lead to positive educational outcomes. And there's definitely ideas and expressions that can in fact interfere with student learning. So this is not something that we can take just on face value. Finally, another assumption that I see baked into this one is this idea that there was this time in US history where higher education was a wide open forum, a place where any idea could be discussed without fear of offending anyone. And like, that's just not true. That never happened. We know there's a history of exclusion of lots of different ideas in higher education, not defending that and saying that it's good, but there was no like historical utopia that we should be going back to. And when there were rousing debates historically in higher education around issues that we would now find controversial, a lot of times the people who would be offended by those ideas weren't even allowed to be in those spaces. So shouldn't be really thinking about going back to some mythical past because that never actually happened. So if we throw out those assumptions that all things can and should be said in spaces on campus, I think we're left with some really important questions. The first is what types of exposure to different perspectives, even offensive perspectives, does lead to positive educational outcomes. That's what we're about in higher education, positive educational outcomes. And this is really an empirical question. We do know some things that can speak to this question. We know that cognitive dissonance is important for learning. But importantly, we also know that there is a difference between dissonance and discomfort. And that while dissonance is educationally beneficial, discomfort is not necessarily. Sometimes discomfort is helpful and sometimes it's actually counterproductive. And so we know things about this, but I think there's a lot more to explore there. We also know that there's positive outcomes from engagement with diverse peers and perspectives in higher education. But we also know that when those experiences are negative, when people perceive something as hostile, as threatening, that can actually lead to negative outcomes. And that's particularly the case when there's not adequate support for making sense of those interactions or those experiences. We also know that there's a lot of negatives associated with students perceiving a negative campus climate for them and people like them. And we also know a lot about things like stereotype threat, and the physical and psychological effects of, say, racism. So there's a lot of things that I think we can bring to bear on this empirical question. I think harder maybe is this question of what are the appropriate boundaries of speech and expression in different speech environments on campus. And this is where I think we got into a lot of discussion, in the previous session of how do we draw those lines? Who gets to draw them? How do we do that? Does that matter in different spaces? I think in some ways the legal part of this, at least at public universities, it's complicated but pretty straightforward. Lawyers in this Zoom room might disagree with me on that, but I think the philosophical part of this question is really where it's hard. It's not the can, but it's the should. And I think bringing those two things together, I think there's a really important question about what does a productive, robust campus climate for dialogue actually look like? The second assumption here is that students, and I would also say faculty, are fully formed static beings with fully formed static opinions about things. And I have to give credit to my colleague Andy Perrin at Johns Hopkins because he's really helped me think about this in an interesting way. Because we think about how we talk about students, how we talk about people sharing their perspectives on campus. We often assume that there's this thing that exists. There are these perspectives, but we know that the purpose of education is change. If everyone here has fully formed perspectives that are solid and concrete, like what are we even doing here? But we also know that many people don't actually have fully formed opinions on the types of issues that tend to spark controversy on campus. Some do, but a lot don't. And what some students may need is actual then support in affirming their developing perspectives and opinion. So the idea that we need to be constantly challenging and questioning people's perspectives may not actually be developmentally and educationally beneficial for all students in every stage of their education. This is complicated, right? Because that's going to be different for different students. But this idea that what we need to be doing is constantly shaking students from their firmly held beliefs, I think is an assumption that doesn't hold, both in the assumption underlying that they have these fully formed firm beliefs, but also that shaking is going to be beneficial for all students. Some students have spent their entire lives encountering perspectives and opinions that challenge their closely held beliefs and even threaten who they are as people. And so encountering one more offensive speaker or comment in class or reading probably isn't going to do much good and may actually do more harm. We also, I think, baked into this assumption, assume that students and potentially faculty have achieved a level of cognitive, interpersonal, and intrapersonal developmental complexity to navigate difficult discussions of controversial issues. But we know that in particular, traditionally aged college students, who are often the ones we're talking about in these discussions, are at a particularly intense developmental stage of life. And so this assumption does not hold. Hopefully by the time they graduate college, we've increased their developmental complexity in all of these areas, but not all students are in the same place in how they think about knowledge, themselves, and their relationships with other people. So again, throwing out those assumptions leaves us with, I think, some really interesting questions. One is, how do we facilitate discussions between those students who do have these strong, informed opinions about these issues and those who don't know much or are still figuring out what they think, when what they need out of that discussion in order to progress educationally and developmentally might be completely different. I think we also need to be thinking about what are the developmental underpinnings of the capacity to engage in these conversations. We know a lot in the college student development literature about cognitive, interpersonal, and intrapersonal development, but not a lot about how they specifically apply to difficult dialogues. I think we also need to be thinking about what experiences can promote development. So I would argue that developmental complexity is foundational to being able to engage with different points of view constructively. So how do we promote that development? And this is one we actually do know a lot about. There's like this huge book on my table right here that's all about what are the ways that college can promote student learning and development. So we know things like positive interactions with diverse peers, participation in learning communities, study abroad, service learning, collaborative learning, small class sizes, student-faculty interactions. I'm not even going to read the whole list that I put in my notes here because there's tons of things that we know that we can be doing. And so I think we need to bring that into our broader discussion about dialogue on campus. How do we promote student development generally so that they have the capacity to do this hard work? The third big umbrella assumption here that I see in these conversations is that college campuses are these bubbles that are separate from the real world in some meaningful way. This leads us to think that we can think about controversial speech issues, difficult dialogues on campus in a vacuum without considering the broader campus climate, the broader cultural climate around the issues in question, and this sort of like contradiction that on the one hand, we think we can somehow engineer the campus environment within that bubble for productive dialogue, Or sort of on the flip side, if everyone would just get out of the way, if administrators would stop trying to engineer the campus environment, everyone would just be able to speak freely and have these great dialogues. But clearly, what goes on off campus affects what happens on campus. Students don't live in a bubble. They know what's going on in the world and they're affected by it. And so when students respond to a particular comment or incident, they're responding in context. That specific context, but also the broader campus and cultural context. For example, in the last session, folks raised these questions, especially in the chat, about rising extremism and January 6th, and how does that influence students' reactions to controversial outside speakers, which I think is a great example of how we can't understand how students engage with difficult issues without understanding that broader context. We can't think about things in a bubble. And when it comes to this idea of engineering campus environments, on the one hand, doing nothing just lets those dynamics off campus dictate the dynamics on campus. On the other hand, cultures and climates are incredibly complex and very hard to change. And this is particularly complicated by the fact that we're not just talking about what's happening right now in thinking about what that climate context is, but we also have to understand sort of the history of issues and how the way we respond to and deal with different issues is also connected to our individual and collective histories. And so this all gets very complicated in trying to think about that relationship between context and dialogue. But if we throw out all the assumptions, all the things we think we know or pretend don't matter in this particular case, I think we have, again, some really important questions. One, just how does that broader context influence how dialogue can and should happen on college campuses? How do different controversies play out differently? Why does one thing explode on one campus and not another? Why are students reacting the way that they are, and how is that connected to the broader environment? And then I think this also leads us to a same question I asked in the first assumption, which is, what does a productive, robust campus climate for dialogue look like? But then also, what gets in the way of that? What makes it hard for us to create a campus that has this productive climate, both things that are going on campus, but also things that are going on off campus, and how do we overcome those challenges? Assumption 4 of 5, getting towards the end, that really connects to that idea of context, is that I think we have this assumption, or maybe a hope, that there are generalizable, scalable solutions to whatever the problem of campus dialogue is. And sort of baked into that is an assumption that campuses are generally the same. We're talking about dialogue on campus, but there's a heck of a lot of campuses out there, and they're all pretty different, and that students are generally the same, but students are also very different. And so everything happens in that context. We need to understand that context and understanding what the problems or the challenges are, but also in what we can do to address those challenges. So what works in one time and place is not necessarily transferable to another time and place and group of people. So that leads us, I think, to a question and perhaps more of a proposition. I couldn't think of how to phrase this other one as a question to fit the theme. But the question I think we want to ask is, what are the key contextual factors to consider? Like, if I look at Lara's program at AU and want to do something like it at the University of Nebraska, these are very different places. So what are the things that I need to consider, and what might work across those contexts, and what I need to change? And then the thing that I think we need to be doing to lead us to better questions around this and better answers is to really engage in this constant cycle of implementation and assessment to develop and evolve our interventions, the things we want to do to promote dialogue on campus that work in a particular context and that can change and adapt over time as that context changes. And so finally, the last assumption I want to address is this idea that if we can fix the problem of dialogue on campus, that we can fix our democracy. And I really want to believe this one, because I love dialogue and I love democracy. And I see a lot of challenges to both right now. But we've been doing dialogue programs on college campuses for a long time. And we still have a lot of problems on campus and in our broader society, particularly around issues of polarization and dialogue across difference. And so I don't think that we can assume that just fixing something in higher education is going to have these large ramifications. But I think that that leads us to some good questions. One is about what are the long-term effects of participating in a dialogue program in higher education. There is some research out there that I've seen, particularly around intergroup dialogue, that shows some, I think the stuff that I've seen is like 1 year out, showing some, good 1 year out positive effects, but I think we need to know much more about what the long-term outcomes are of these types of programs and experiences. And then related to that, how do we infuse those programs and those experiences with intentional attention to transfer and integration of knowledge? We know things about transfer of learning and integration of learning, particularly that it needs to be intentional and facilitated. People don't generally take something they've learned in one context and apply it in a vastly different context without some intentionality behind that. And so how do we work that into our programs? But then ultimately, and maybe this is like a sad, depressing note to end on before we move into the conversation, but I think we need to be thinking about and exploring what the limitations of dialogue on college campuses is in promoting democracy more broadly. And I think that that's important to consider, because I think it leads us to then this other question of what else do we need to be doing in higher education to protect, promote, and or transform, from whatever perspective you come to democracy with, democracy, right? What else can we be doing that's not necessarily dialogue? So with that, I will stop talking and stop sharing my screen here once I get back to the right window to do that. Maybe I will. There we go. Too many things going on. And so thank you all for bearing with me through all of that. And I am super interested to hear what comments and questions folks have. I think there might already be some stuff in the chat, but I'll let Lara.
Yeah, I see there was something in the chat about a book. What book you were mentioning?
Elizabeth, right at the beginning of her talk, she had a giant book. Yeah, that one.
Yes, here, I'll not blur my background for a second so you can see it. How College Affects Students, Volume 3. There's 2 other volumes. It is a very thick book.
So I realize I did not note at the beginning of the session that that I am taking the role of Joe Young, who was called away on work travel to facilitate this session. So those of you who came as Joe Young stands, my apology, but I hope to help bring out a great conversation with all of you. We're gonna do the same format as before with, raise hands, throw things into the chat. We'll kind of go back and forth, but I did want to kind of throw in what I think is a really big question in this area, which is what we think we know and what we might still need to know about the extent to which there is, a self-censorship crisis, a freedom crisis on campus. And I'll say in the course of, even receiving very constructive, very helpful peer reviews and peer reads on a book that I have coming out about dialogue, one person who otherwise had really great things to say about how I describe dialogue wrote, I don't know if we two live in the same universe, because you, Lara, speaking to me, don't think there's this giant crisis, and I totally am living in this crisis. We might not live in the same world. And there are even people that I know who are on who are on our Zoom today, who are very, very concerned about a crisis, and very, very concerned about particularly what we can extrapolate from polling that tends to show that people have concerns about what they'll say in front of their peers or what they'll say in front of their professors. You referred to the Knight surveys, but there's also the Heterodox Academy and FIRE and a few other surveys that lots of us on this Zoom have read, and I know you've read. So that seems like a place to go, right? Like we in a field full of people who tend to be very thoughtful about what conclusions we draw and defend and support seem to have come to very different conclusions, many of us, about what we know, in particular about the source and nature of students' concerns about what they can say. So I'm wondering if you can kind of reflect on that, and we'll take it to everyone else as well.
Yes. So this is like a whole other soapbox that I have. Maybe I should have put it as one of the assumptions. I think there is an assumption that there is a self-censorship crisis on college campuses, and I would contest that. In fact, the title of my senior fellow project for the UC Center is Beyond the Moral Panic of Student Self-Censorship. So just to like give you a clue as to my perspective on this from the get-go. And where I come down on this based on my read of the survey data that's out there and my own research, which is more qualitative in nature with in-depth interviews with students, is that self-censorship and crisis are not the right way or not a helpful way of framing the very complicated dynamics of engaging in dialogue around difficult, complicated issues with people who are very different from yourself. That actually, this is a really, really complicated, hard thing we're asking students to do, and that we're expecting students to do. And then we're getting all upset when they feel uneasy about it. And when they feel like maybe they shouldn't speak up about something. And I find that students have a lot of reasons for what they do or do not say in class. Some of them are probably, problematic self-censorship. Although I hate the word self-censorship for a whole other set of reasons. But a lot of it is just like really normal stuff, like really normal human stuff, like that we talked about in the last session. I feel like I'm part of a community in this class. And so I'm thinking about the community. I'm thinking about the effect on the community of saying a particular thing. I'm thinking about my relationships with other people. I am thinking about whether this comment is going to be productive in this context. Is it going to help me and my peers further our understanding of a particular topic? Like, I'm actually really impressed by the types of things that students are thinking about when they think about whether, when, and how to share their perspectives in class. I think another important factor is that I forget which assumption this is in, but this idea that like students have perspectives to express, I think also is underpinning this self-censorship conversation. And there's a lot of what I hear from students is like, I don't know what I think about this issue, so I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to listen and think about this. But I might have some ideas, but like, I don't want to sound like an idiot. I don't really know a lot about this. I'm here to learn. And so it's complicated. There's a lot going on, but I think the self-censorship crisis narrative is actually really counterproductive, because the other thing I've heard from a lot of students is this idea that, well, I know that people like me don't speak up in class, and so it must be dangerous. And so it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I have a lot on this self-censorship idea, but I'll just throw those things out for now.
So I think there are some questions coming up in the chat. So I'm just going to uplift Nathan's point. On the one hand, we're asking what dialogue accomplishes. Does it serve the student? Does it serve the university? Does it serve democracy? On the other hand, going back to the idea of community, is dialogue good in and of itself? So I guess I don't know if you want to sort of address that idea, which I think probably applies to a ton of things in education. What, is there utility, the whole thing.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. And Nathan, I'd love to hear your thoughts more on it, because it makes me think of like the fact that there's like a telic and an atelic dimension to dialogue, right? There's a goal, an outcome that we want to see, but then there's also something that may be inherently valuable in it, separate from any outcome, right? There might be just value in engaging in dialogue just because it is, because there's a human good in it. I tend to think more from the like goal outcome, because I'm an educational researcher. I think about goals and outcomes. But I think it's fascinating to think about this more philosophical, like inherent good, existential sort of value in it. But I don't know that I have an answer to that. But I think it can be both. It can be both at the same time, and that might even strengthen the argument for promoting more dialogue.
See that Jenny has their hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention too that if you look carefully at the questions that are asked or the items that are on some of those surveys from FIRE and Heterodox and others, that there's not a whole lot of conceptual or operational clarity on what they mean or what it is that they're measuring. And so I'd like to see a lot more work done on developing those measures in a way that's more conceptually clear. And I think that that's part of where this issue comes from too. But I also feel like there's an expectation that anybody wanting to not say anything or expecting other people to not say anything is seen as inherently problematic, when we know that there are always times when there are things we should not say in particular circumstances, and things that, there's a particular time and place for these kinds of things. And so, the fact that sometimes I don't want to say something out loud isn't, as Beth has said, like, yeah, some of this is inherently problematic, but some of it's exactly what you'd want people to do, like in a classroom.
Yeah, what actually led me to this area of work in part was being on a panel at the American Historical Association conference. And the topic is, it was about controversial issues in self-censorship. I don't even remember the name of the panel, but this idea of self-censorship came up, and I made this point that, like, well, don't we want students actually to be thinking about what they say and how and the effect it might have on other people? And like half the people in the room nodded, and the other half of the people looked at me like I had three heads. Like this was just totally crazy to be saying. And that's what sort of one of the things that led me to think there was something here.
One of the things that might be leading people to say there's a there, and it can be circular, right? Because the polls from which we're working, they have varying sources, and some of them come from organizations that very much have an agenda they want to promote, and others are more journalistic. So, context matters, but a lot has been made of, a partisan divide in the way that people answer this question about what they're ready to say. Now, there's a part of me that chafes against that. And I think this comes in connection with your excellent point about how fully formed we are and how fully formed our opinions are. And, so I teach law and politics, and we know, right, that most of us don't arrive at our policy preferences by way of saying, like, I will address this question, as a question and crank out a solution based on reason. A lot of our what we kind of call policy preferences outside of universities, outside of academic spaces, are really identities. I'm on this team. This is how this team does this thing. And to me, that seems very ill suited to academic dialogue. It seems like the exact opposite of what we do. So I have chafed at the idea of people coming in and saying, well, I am a conservative, like I am left-handed and I can't talk, because I just want people to be coming into these spaces, not as a conservative or a liberal or a leftist or a libertarian, but as a scholar with a question or a student with a question. But that's not super realistic, partly because maybe we don't even talk to students about changing that orientation to come into the classroom. But for whatever it's worth, for however imperfect that that characterization is, you know, what we know is that students who come into our campuses saying, well, I think of myself as conservative, express this concern more than people who come into our campuses saying, you know, I think of myself as liberal or moderate. And so I guess that brings us back to the what do we know about why that is? What more do we need to know about why that is? And then this is sort of a ton of questions in one, both for you and the group. What do we know about the answer to that? Sometimes I've seen the answer to that posed as like, well, we need more diversity of opinion among, you know, the administrators or among the faculty. What do we know about this issue that comes down, at least in a lot of these surveys, to one related to ideology?
Yeah, so I think this is where the lack of conceptual clarity that Jenny called out is a real issue, because I think what we think we know what students are thinking when they're answering those questions, right? We think we know what it means when a student says that they often hold back their opinion in class because they're afraid of how students or faculty or administrators might respond, right? We think we know what that means, but we don't. And I know that because I ask students that question and then I talk to them about it. And I ask them what they mean. And I ask them to tell me about a time when they've actually done that. And what I find in talking with students is that their answer to that question is often an expression of identity. It is not actually an assessment of their behavior. It is an expression of, I am the type of person who has to hold my opinion in class because other people might attack me. Or I'm the type of person who always says exactly what I think, right? In my project, the students who say that they always speak up in class, right? They never hold back their opinion. There's not many of them, but I've been able to get every single one of them to tell me about a time when they have. Some time when they have changed how or what they say because of other people. Because we're human beings and like that's a reasonable thing to do. And the students who tell me that they always hold back their opinion in class or often hold back their opinion in class, you know, rarely is it because they've had a negative experience themselves. Sometimes, right? I have talked to students who like have had professors or other students do really shitty things. Like that happens, of course it does. But often their perspective on this is driven by that I'm part of a group, right? I'm the type of person who can't speak up. This is what I hear from my brother. This is what I hear from my friends. This is what I hear on social media, right? That people like me can't speak up. And this is where I think the real problem with that crisis narrative comes in, because if that then does influence their behavior, which I suspect that it does, that's a real problem. That is getting in the way of students being able to come to dialogues and actually participate constructively with each other, because they have this sense that people like them or people who have this opinion can't share it in class or somewhere else on campus. So I'm not saying there aren't challenges, right? Particularly around like affective polarization and group identity and all of this. Like we clearly have challenges in our society writ large. But a lot of this student self-censorship stuff is just way more complicated than that. And I think the survey data we have doesn't really tell us what we think it's telling us.
I have to say, I thought there would be lots of people jumping up to dispute this question that's been very hot, at least in the national narrative. I'm wondering. So I see some stuff in the chat that looks good, but I'm wondering as well, and I'll process the stuff in the chat and bring it back. What do we know about, if anything, about some of the claims that we do know, like such as that this is sort of an increasing problem now? Do we know the extent to which, for example, the makeup of Catherine mentioned administrators, or the makeup of faculty, the ideological makeup of campuses affects this question of students' interest or feelings of freedom to engage?
So we don't have good longitudinal data that would necessarily speak to this question directly. And I think there's problems with like all the survey data out there. So even if we did have longitudinal survey data on some of these questions, it may or may not tell us what we need to know. There is some evidence that, like, say, the faculty has gotten more liberal, progressive over time, but then there's also work that challenges that. And again, sort of makes me question whether, say, faculties express political beliefs actually, well, there's evidence that it doesn't actually affect what happens in the classroom to a large extent, but then also it's questionable whether faculty are as liberal as we think we are. There may be some social norming happening where, like, again, like faculty, we think we're supposed to be really liberal. We think we're super liberal, but like actually, like, higher ed's a pretty conservative institution, which I know sounds really weird to say, but it is. And so like, as someone who studies higher ed, like, higher ed resists change and faculty resist change a lot. And so I would kind of call into question the narrative that the faculty have actually become more liberal. In some ways it's probably true, and in some ways it's not. I think if you look historically, there have been controversies and challenges over speech and discourse on college campuses forever. The nature somewhat changes over time, given the particular historical context. But I think it's probably overblown to say that we are in a particularly bad moment for speech on campus. That might actually change as we see a lot of the legislative threats to speech and academic freedom. But you think about McCarthyism, and that was a pretty bad time for robust speech on campus. So I think, not to minimize the relational dynamics that students are feeling, where they don't want to say something that's going to make everyone hate them. That's real. That's always a problem. Well, not a problem. That's always a challenge, right? That's always a consideration. But are we in a particular crisis moment? No, we're just in a different manifestation of the same thing that has always been going on in a lot of ways.
There's there's a comment from Robert Richards in the chat, and it's interesting to me as someone who considers myself a free speech advocate and a dialogue proponent. So I'm interested in this differentiation, but he writes, one way to characterize the difference in viewpoints between free speech advocates and dialogue proponents is that free speech advocates tend to focus on just one dimension of communication, the message or content dimension, yet dialogue proponents tend to focus on at least two dimensions of communication, the message content dimension and the relational dimension. A lot of the learning scholarship suggests that the attention of both dimensions of communications leads to better learning outcomes. So I think that both things sounds very wise. And I'm going to turn it to Colin with a comment, but I think this is an important thing to note that probably in a lot of spaces many of us are in, there are people who are primarily focused on referring to this as a free speech issue, and others referring to it as a dialogue issue. I tend to fall in the both camp with Robert Richards, but I'll turn it over to Colin.
Actually, do you want to reply first before my comment, just to give you a chance to jump in, or I can just jump in with my comment? Up to you.
Yeah, I will just say, like, yes, right? Like the relational dimension is incredibly important from a learning perspective, from a community perspective, from a democracy perspective. There's some really good, I think, sort of like moral philosophy schools that would speak to some of these, like, justice rights orientations versus more of an ethic of care and relationality. And so the more we can infuse that sort of relational community aspect into this, I think the better off we'll be overall. So that would be my 2 cents.
Yeah, I just had a question about the self-censorship narrative, which I've heard many, many times. And I have also received pushback from it, but I guess I will say individually, I have felt it to be a powerful device for thinking about things. So I maybe I'll have some questions. But one of them, I guess, is in response to faculty. There has certainly been a shift, at least, okay, anecdotally. So I'm going to preface all of this with these are anecdotes. But given the higher stakes of being called out or canceled or social media or having people demand that you be fired by the higher administration, there seems to be a greater reluctance, maybe not among students, but maybe among faculty, to not want to engage or touch a particular topic in class if they can avoid it, because the stakes do seem to be different. Maybe I'm wrong about this. But in terms of what the costs would be to actually bring up certain issues or to encourage them, if we're now in a culture where taking people to task much more strongly is encouraged or more prominent or more likely. Again, maybe that's not true. Maybe people have been threatened and asked to be fired for the past 60 years, and we're just now deciding to focus on it. But I'd just be curious if you think at least that kind of censorship has not increased given the willingness to want to fire people for beliefs or ostracize people or shame them online or in social media in the past, 10 years.
So I think there's a number of dynamics at play here. One of them is the increasing precarity of the faculty. Right, so the decrease in tenured and tenure-line positions, the increased use of adjuncts and lecturers who are sometimes on, at best 1-year renewable contracts where they can be not renewed for any reason. And you see a lot of the actual firings that happen, again, anecdotally, really, really being targeted at non-tenure track faculty. As a tenured professor, I'm not 100% secure. I could do things that could get me fired. Like, tenure's not a free pass. But I am a lot more secure than my untenured and not tenurable colleagues. And so I think that the decline of tenure is a huge factor involved in the precarity that faculty feel. Another issue, of course, is social media. Social media sort of breaks down the boundaries that we used to have in our lives in some ways, right? So the person who I am outside of the classroom and outside of my job is more now connected to the person I am inside my job. So those lack of boundaries make it so that it's just easier to get ourselves into trouble and to say stupid things that then blow up. That's a challenge for sure, because people say stupid things all the time. And I'm a big believer in second chances and all that, but that leads to some challenging situations. I think also, what was the point? One of the other sort of contextual challenges with this, I do think, is how we are, my perception at least, is that we are in a period of particularly rapid social change. And so it can be hard for faculty to keep up with some things. And students are, I think often expressing their frustration with the world and with faculty not always keeping up with the way that the world is changing. Often for the better, not always. And so I think there are opportunities for faculty and administrators to listen to students more, to not just cave into whatever students want. That's not what I'm saying, but I think often there's something that students are communicating. And so there's better ways often of engaging with students. A lot of times when these things blow up, when something that a professor says blows up, it is not the first time that something has happened. It is not the first time that students have tried to address it with that professor. There's often a lot going on. And so, yes, I do think there's a vibe out there that faculty are scared of students. But I think it's really complicated. And I think, we're probably heading in the wrong direction for addressing that, between the increasing, rate at which tenure line positions are disappearing and being replaced with precarious positions, and the states that are engaging in legislative censorship. That's definitely not going to help. So hopefully that addresses what you were asking.
Before we get to Tom, who I know has a lot of thoughts on these, just a couple of things to throw in there. If you talk about the free speech dialogue tension, which I think it's all of a piece, one place that I depart with FIRE on the way that it evaluates expressive freedom is that it tends to classify all student complaints as sort of bad free speech incidents. And a problem with characterizing things that way is that coming to administrators and saying, this is a problem that I have with the community that I'm in or the people in my community. It is speech, and it's a form of speech and civic engagement that students have. And sometimes it happens against the backdrop of them not knowing, for example, freedom of expression policies, but it is them engaging their community. So I think treating all of these things as pathological is both a mistake as a way of measuring things, but it's also a mistake even like normatively, because I don't think we want to be training students out of saying this is what I want in my community. But in the context, as Beth said, of decreases in tenure and legislation, and I'm term faculty, and legislative threats, I think this question of how to frame, how to ensure that universities have faculty's back such that a student saying I have a problem with this doesn't lead to people being fired. It leads to a good and productive conversation. I think this is something that we need to be grappling with. And I finally said something that lit up the hand raise. So I've done my job here. So I'm going to send it to Tom, but then I see that there are other hands in response to this as well.
You're muted.
Sorry about that. Elizabeth, I really appreciate the presentation, and there's lots of it that I agree with. And I especially agree with the point that self-censorship is by itself an ambiguous term, because there are good forms of it and bad forms of it. That part is absolutely right. On the other hand, if it's an urban legend that's the self-censorship problem is a problem, it's a very firmly rooted urban legend that many people, I've heard many students know, I'm no social scientist, but I've heard many students say this to me, and faculty say this to me. And absolutely, the thing that you last said about precarious faculty is completely true. So I'm the chair of the Faculty Senate. I have to recruit people from various committees. I just spent an hour on the phone with somebody who would refuse to be the chair of a committee because they're afraid they're going to say something that's going to piss off the provost and they're going to get fired, right? Or they'll suffer consequences. So it seems to me that it's not all hunky-dory. And even if it's the question of students' identities that they're really expressing when they talk about self-censorship, which seems completely right, doesn't that still seem kind of problematic as educators that because of identities that students are bringing to the class. And I'm trying to frame this in a way that avoids the question of what's the cause, because I think that's the thing that we're really is the controversial part. Isn't that a problem for us as educators, that in some sense we're failing, or we have this obstacle before we even begin our work, that that students, for whatever reason, feel very, very anxious about talking in class?
Yes, so 100%. And when I say that, I think that the student self-censorship crisis narrative is the wrong framing. It's because I think there's better framings for understanding what's actually happening and what we should do about it. I think that the way we frame the problem dictates our solutions. If the problem is students are censorious snowflakes, right, that leads us to one set of solutions that would address that. Excuse me, if the problem or the challenge is this is actually really hard, there are a number of ethical and moral dimensions to what we're asking students to do. It's that students aren't coming to higher education with the skills to do this, with the experience to do this. If it's that students don't know a lot about the topics we're asking them to discuss, that leads us to a whole other set of things that are much more within the realm of educators to deal with. And so I think understanding the problem is really key. And so I'm not saying there aren't problems or challenges. 100% there are. I think we need to understand what those are differently. And so, when I hear students tell me, like, I never in high school had a conversation about political topics with people who disagreed with me, I'm like, okay, this is where we're starting from when students come here. And so we got to do something, right? Like, we have to teach them how to engage in these conversations. And that's not all about, oh, you should just be open to hearing offensive ideas. It's how do you express yourself in a way that's constructive in a dialogue? How do you listen in a way that's constructive? How do you tell people when they've said something that's really awful, right? And that causes harm to you in some way? How do we understand the harm that can actually happen in speech and what we do about that? This is all really hard and complicated, but it's very different than just saying, like, wow, students these days don't know how to, like, listen to different perspectives. Or students are going to attack each other if they hear something that they don't like. Maybe some of that's going on, but a lot of what's going on is this more complicated stuff. And I think we can deal with the complicated stuff, but we have to recognize that it's complicated.
So I think it was Sarah and then Carlos.
Okay. Hi, Elizabeth. Thank you so much for your talk today. This is really interesting stuff. My question is actually exactly about the skills that you were just talking about. So I'm a philosopher, I teach philosophy, and I work in the deliberation space as well. And so my question as an educator is always sort of about how to get my students to develop philosophical skills, to develop the skills of charitable argument reconstruction, just as you did in your talk, discovering the presuppositions in a particular argument, articulating the most powerful objections to the argument, and assessing the responses to those objections and all of that. And so one thing I've noticed, and of course this is anecdotal, but over the course of the semester, the quality of classroom discussion improves as I think I see my students increase their skill set along all of those dimensions. And so my question with respect to, like, dialogue and deliberation specifically is, going back to the kind of topic of this talk, what do we need to know about the problem of dialogue on campus? What is your kind of assessment about the relationship between the quality of dialogue on our campuses and the skill set with which students are coming in to higher ed? And obviously the answer may differ from one type of institution to another. And then how do we, what do we do once we kind of understand whether there's a problem with the skill set? Do institutions make big, broad changes, or is it really up to individual faculty members to do that? That's the kind of family of questions.
Yeah, so from what I know from my research and talking with colleagues in P-12 education, and having a general sense of the state of P-12 education, I think students are generally coming with very few skills for engaging in dialogue. I very much think that we need in higher education, both institutionally and as faculty members, to recognize that and address it. I think just as we teach college level writing in most colleges in some way, we should be teaching, dialogue and discussion for, college level work, and whatever we call it. That's a terrible name for it, but like, we need to have classes on dialogue, and they need to be like specific intentional courses around dialogue, and then that needs to also be infused throughout the curriculum. We know that a one-off is not going to do it. We need to be reinforcing those skills in many courses, and in many co-curricular experiences as well. And so I think there's things, again, institutionally and individually, we should be doing. I think that individual stuff is only going to go so far, because these experiences and this learning needs to be connected across multiple experiences that students are having, for us to see any real change and real transferable change. But I think that's, if there is a silver bullet, that's it. But it's not really a silver bullet, because it's going to look different on every campus.
And before Carlos comes in, I'll just say it's not only going to look different on every campus, but it could potentially look different in each class and even for each student. And I think that really gets to Beth's comment about, not all campuses are the same, and bearing down into what it means for the students to do this dialogue. So a thing that I've observed is I now ask all of my students, what do you think class time is for at the beginning of every semester? And it's an interesting question post-COVID, when everyone's like, oh, we didn't have classes, that was really bad, or they weren't in person, that was really bad. It's like, why? What are we doing here? And what I've learned over time is that not very many people are asking that question. And it can be similarly over time teaching, I've come to design somewhat better papers, and I've come to design somewhat better class experiences. But I think, understanding that students are going to come into the classroom not only with very different competencies around dialogues, but actually really different understandings of what we're supposed to be doing with that dialogue and what it means to be doing that well. And then, of course, both because our different, our disciplines have different ways of doing things and ways of addressing questions, and each of us has academic freedom, and we're going to approach teaching in our own way. I think it's going to be true that what we do with class time and what we do with our dialogue actually has different meanings in each class, but at least a baseline that we are working on this, and that students understand this is a question that we're asking. What is this time for, and how we're going to use it? Seems like it's a very big step. And I would say I'm not so much biased. I only use the term bias for what it really means. I'm partial to the approach that is, teaching dialogue as a college competency and getting students thinking about what they want to do with their dialogue, because it's what I do. But I would just caution people against thinking that there's a perfect way that every one of our students are going to think about it. I have said this story before, but I had one class in one living learning cohort at AU where 3 students told me, this is the most diverse place I've ever been. This is the least diverse place I've ever been. And I didn't know what white people thought of us until I got here. That's 3 students in the same class in the same living learning community. All of them have not only experienced previous opportunities for dialogue across difference or dialogue across groups and communities that were wildly different from one another, but they were even experiencing a college transition and the same university wildly differently from one another as a result of those changes. And so I think anything that we do build into our curricula has to involve a bit of self-reflection about what people have done before, how they were experiencing this campus differently, and what that change of things, even from like sort of outlier to in-group, if you're coming to AU, which is a very blue campus, from sort of a red place, to people who are going from maybe dominant way of thinking to outlier. That could happen in your same classroom. There could be people who have moved from feeling like outliers to feeling like less so, and to the opposite of that, and everything in between. And just being conscious of how that could play into their capacity for dialogue, I think is really important. But Carlos almost definitely has something much smarter to say.
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but and I don't want to take up too much time since I'm speaking tomorrow. I want to present a case study, and Elizabeth, I'd like you to apply your 5 assumptions, which I found very useful to this. And some of the comments by Sarah and Lara, just you, about different kinds of spaces on campus, and what Colin said. So 3 years ago, at age 86, I was hired by our School of Medicine to come in and shape a new curriculum they wanted, which they already had a title for, called HESJAR, which is Health, Equity, Social Justice, and Anti-Racism. I and my partner, within a pediatrician within the school, were given 8 hours with the students in their first year, and 8 hours their second year, with the 2-hour modules spread out throughout the and throughout the entire year, teaching a class of 100 students and engaging them in, quote, dialogue about tricky issues. Okay, so developing their developmental skills out the window, being able to create understanding of what dialogue is out the window. We had 3 topics to cover in 8 hours throughout an entire school year. So I was looking at ways to get them involved. And one of the things I found, the thing that Colin was saying was absolutely true. The students, even though it is one of the most ethnically diverse medical schools in the United States, and it's been written up because of that. And even because the students, as part of their interviews, they talk about health equity as part of their interviews to be selected for the school. When it came to talking about health equity in the classroom, they remained generally mum, wouldn't say much of anything. However, I tried different strategies, and here's what I'd like you to kind of apply this in analysis. I wanted to get them to address the question, how is anti-racism different than opposition to racism in a more traditional sense? And how would that apply to medical practice? That was the basic question. When I brought this question up, silence in the room. However, when I brought up the question, said, type into your computers and flash it on the screen what you think, and your name will not appear next to what you say on the screen, it was a deluge from the students. At which point, I responded to the deluge on the screen, not to the students in the room, but then turned and found the students in the room suddenly were jumping in and talking about these things. So I stepped back and said, okay, what's happening? Why is this dialogue suddenly happening? Because of an intervening thing I've done of anonymity on the screen. So I want to step back and say, what's going on, and what might this help us think differently about the issue of getting at dialogue? Look, I'll step back at this point.
So I have a couple of thoughts on that. I don't know how well it connects to the assumptions I talked about, but we'll see as I talk, maybe it will more. One of the things that comes to mind is, like, that's just a really good teaching technique, right? Like, It's a think, pair, share. It's the classic, like, get students to think about something quietly, write it down before they have to express it. So there's part of it that's probably just that, like, that's a really good technique to foster more classroom discussion. There's probably also a sense of it where, especially if a lot of what students were putting up on the screen, if they agreed with each other a lot, or if there was a lot of diversity of the perspectives, that could differently, help students feel a little bit more comfortable speaking up. What I think about when I think about a room full of medical students are the students who I interviewed in my project who were in like education or architecture or these very like athletic training, right? These very professionally oriented fields where the people they're sitting in class with are going to be their professional colleagues. They're going to be the people who they have to work with in their careers, who might someday be in charge of hiring them or not, or who might, have some influence over their career success. And so there's a level of care that people take in what they say in those settings, quite reasonably so, because they view that not as a, free-ranging classroom debate that's just about being in class. They see it as a professional environment, like being in a workplace. And so that's going to have a very different dynamic than like random sociology class, right? Where the students don't have to worry about, whether the person next to them is going to hire or fire them someday. And so I suspect that med school would have a similar dynamic there. And that's something where they could sort of just start to see that like either everyone has similar experiences on the same page. Okay, so we can talk about this, or like, wow, people have a lot of different opinions, but some people agree with me. Other people don't. That's interesting. Maybe we can talk about this. I think that's a really good strategy to get the ball rolling. I don't know if that gets at what you were hoping I would say in response, but those are my thoughts. Feel free to push me if there's aspects of that don't get at your question.
So there's some good stuff happening in the chat. This concern that their peers will remember what they say from Maya, and it will be used to come back against them when they run for public office. And AU is a place where definitely people could be in the lunchroom thinking about their Senate confirmation hearings. So that really resonated. It could come back when they run for public office, go for a big job, etc. Some of which sounds right, like people being aware that their communications are forever actually sounds like good practice. But I think Maya's describing something beyond that, maybe, of people having a real concern that that speech could come back to bite them. And I'm wondering, whether it's you, Beth, or just the sense of the group, how do we make space for people to talk so that they can learn and try without consequences that are sort of brutal.
Well, I think this touches on one of the assumptions that I was trying to upend, right? This idea that like people are fully formed beings with these fully formed opinions. I think that students often make that assumption of each other. And one of the complexities that I've been grappling with in my research is this idea of the extent to which we do or should take what people say as an indication of their character, right? How much does someone's opinion that they express in class reflect on who they are as a person? And to some extent, of course it does, right? Like, we're human. You say something and I'm going to internalize that and use that as part of how I understand who you are. But to some extent, that really gets in our way, right? Because if what I say is then going to peg me as this kind of person forever, right? And there's no allowance for, I'm just trying out an idea, or I maybe will change my mind, then that's, of course, I don't want to say anything that's going to like stick with me forever. But then also, like, yeah, what people say does say something about them. The students I talked to actually, for the most part, are like a one-off comment. Yeah, like that might not be meaningful in terms of who this person is, depending on what it is. Like some things that are really like far out of bounds for the student I'm talking to, maybe they're like, yeah, no, I'm done with that person. But they tend to look for more patterns of behavior. But I don't think that that's how it feels to students necessarily in terms of how they're going to be judged by other people. And honestly, it's really complicated, right? Like this is really complicated, this question of how much should we judge other people based on what they say?
I see Michelle is is waiting.
Hi, first of all, thank you, Lara, and to the terrific speakers. This certainly isn't anything new, but speaking to this idea of things, being afraid of what can happen because of what you say. I mean, I think that I just wonder, to me, it raises questions about what are consequences, what are appropriate consequences for speech, right? I mean, I don't love the term free speech for lots of reasons. And one of them is I think it sometimes makes it sound like that there's an absence of consequences. But I also see that we look around in our world and there doesn't really seem to me to be a great model for restoration or repair. And I think that has a lot to do with what may or may not be happening in the classroom, which is that if we can't see the more adults, right, finding a way to repair and restore relationships and careers, right, after something that is said, you know, and let's go with maybe the people who say something and let's just assume that it was sort of not malintended, but it was just the impact. So I think that there's a lot of pieces there, and I don't have an answer, but I don't think that there is role modeling for that. And I think to myself, you know, this is the work that, you know, I do is run a free speech center. Like, I don't know that I'd want to talk in class, forget because of the professor, but because of my peers. And yeah, what they might do with that information, just either what I say or type it down or take a video. And I think it goes a lot to like this idea of how do you repair when there's harmful, offensive content on campus generally. We've talked a lot about forums, and I resonate a lot with what Beth has talked about, this idea of curation. And I do think we do a lot of curation in teaching, learning in the classroom. I think we do a lot less curation like in the public spaces. But either way, I don't think we have a model for repair after there is these like breaches in relationships, whether they're relationships peer-to-peer, peer-to-faculty. So I think that's important.
It is very important. I'll note that I put in the chat people who are familiar with Loretta Ross, who did not, she said she didn't invent the concept of calling in rather than calling out, but she's sort of popularized it. I think this gets to, you know, I think we need to know more about how much we can do, whether as faculty or administrators, to lay the groundwork for people to have a comfort trying ideas. Beth characterized it as, you know, I was trying something out, and understanding the difference between, for example, trolling or being this person who has these, you know, this is who I am, as opposed to this is the dialogue that I'm having. So I want to flag before I get back to Maya, you know, that some of the things we'll be talking about in tomorrow's sessions really are the what does it take to make space for dialogue, but that faculty, this is a space where faculty have a lot of capacity to enable dialogue, because there's something different between a well-designed classroom exercise and people in which people engage with, for example, the really challenging policy question of you know, under what circumstances parental consent is required for access to certain medical care or certain books and ideas, right? Versus simply a political firestorm, right? We in classrooms can actually construct a collaborative inquiry that that's well designed, like Carlos's exercise, and our capacity to change the way people see sort of political disputes outside of the classroom, I think is maybe a little less, but some of that groundwork laying, I think, can happen in classrooms, and the idea that people are going to be good at it outside of classrooms first seems really unrealistic. But I will kick it back over to Maya.
Thanks, everyone. Yeah, I think just to add on to some of the points raised, I think the other thing, another thing a student said to me, is a student at a somewhat politically mixed campus, and what she said to me was that she was in a program that was supposed to be fostering dialogue across political difference. And she told me that she felt like it took an entire year for the students to develop enough trust with each other that they actually felt comfortable speaking their perspectives, particularly the students who felt that they were in the minority. And so I think that it just also really made me think about the issues of trust building, of preemptive trust building, of where that trust building needs to happen. I think to Colin's point, not just in the classroom, but across campus spaces, who's supposed to do that trust building. And I think the other piece is that I have found Nancy Thomas and Margaret Brower's framework that they put together called Campus Climate for Political Learning and Engagement in Democracy Conceptual Framework, which is quite a mouthful, but I'll drop it into the chat. And the thing that I really appreciate about it is that it situates the co-curricular and the curricular stuff around campus learning and engagement climate amidst the structural, cultural, human, and political factors that are all impacting campuses. And I think that is really helpful for me in terms of thinking about like the many things that are shaping the relationality, the trust, the incentives, like all the things that we're talking about. But yeah, I think it really made me think about how trust is built and how trust is lost. And then to Michelle's point, how that then supports what repair or restoration is or does or doesn't feel possible after breaches.
So I got a comment in the chat that I'm just gonna uplift, which was about where all these concerns might originate. And there are these factors external to our campuses. There are legislative threats coming largely from the right. There are cultural shifts that maybe come more from the left, honestly. Maybe culture shifting leftward quickly. And I'm wondering, and one of our participants was wondering is, to what extent can we understand, is this an issue that comes from left or right? Is it productive to think of it as a left or right issue or some other kind of issue? And what do we know about this, but also what would it be useful to understand about this as a kind of a political problem, I guess, or an ideological problem? Is your hand going back up to answer that, or was it just still up?
Sorry, just still up.
Okay, I'm wondering, Beth, I was sort of pitching that back toward you if you have thoughts, but.
I'll be honest, I'm not sure entirely what your question is. Can you, I got lost in there. So I was hoping someone else would start so that I could catch up.
All right, I guess what do we know or what do we need to know about the question whether the forces that are either interfering with dialogue or could liberate our dialogue or are something from the left, something from the right, neither, both?
I mean, so FIRE has some databases that actually will speak to where some of the threats come from, like where disinvitations come from, threats to FIRE faculty, things like that. I think on the one hand, it's important and informative to understand what's driving the threats, but at the same time, I don't know that it matters, because I think the way we shore up our sort of institutions and shore up the sort of foundations of our ability to engage in dialogue on campus maybe are independent of where the threats are coming from. And so that might take us sort of down a rabbit hole that ends up just being like framing it as this sort of left-right issue, like, no, you're stifling dialogue on campus more, like, no, you're more censorious, no, you are. And I don't know, does that really get us anywhere? We're really like, we can be like, hey, let's tenure more faculty, maybe let's unionize our faculties, I don't know, and let's build a more robust understanding of academic freedom and the public good mission of the university. Like, that really, it doesn't matter who's more at fault or who's the stronger like threat to dialogue and academic freedom on campus. Let's just shore up the foundations no matter where the threat's coming from.
We're running up on time, but we've got Jenny and Carlos, and then we'll say our parting thoughts till tomorrow.
I was just going to mention that there's a really interesting book that I've so far only gotten to sort of skim, but I have it right here and I'll be reading it soon. It's called The Channels of Student Activism: How the Left and Right Are Winning and Losing. Students that wrote it basically are arguing that for their ability to engage in speech is from outside group, like other places, and that's where people were talking about initiatives and where those are coming from. They are in students to
I don't know if it's freezing on my end or on Jenny's end. Is it Jenny's?
Yeah. She's frozen for me too.
Yeah, she's frozen.
Yikes.
Yeah.
Jenny.
Let's do we still have
yes,
Carlos?
a very great book for answering this question as well. Throw in my plug as well.
And I posted the book in the chat. Do we still have Carlos?
Yeah, like, come here.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah, very quickly. Something goes back to Elizabeth's first assumption in response to your question. I think we're dealing, how should I put it? My own research on the clash of diversity and speech has led me to the conclusion that almost nobody believes in free speech, or for that matter, academic freedom. They believe in academic prerogatives, very broad ones, or very robust speech, but they all have boundaries. But Elizabeth used a term, and it has been brought up again. I want to bring it up here: appropriate boundaries. And I think the debate is not about boundaries. The debate is about appropriateness. And when you're talking about is, you have people with very, very, very different worldviews about what those boundaries should be. And that's what we're ultimately contending with when we're talking about dialogue, is these competing, and not bipolar competing, but competing from many directions, vision of what appropriateness is when it refers to boundaries on speech and expression. So that's my 2 cents.